Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you have a new Dungeons and Dragons video. But really quick, before I dive into today's video, I definitely could use your support as a growing YouTube channel. What you can do is you can like, comment, subscribe. That helps pushes me up in the YouTube algorithm. English sometimes can be so challenging. And also, I have a Patreon page. You can check that out. The link is down below in the video description, and that's a way you can provide additional support if you would like to. Anyway, let's get into today's video because today I'm going to be talking about creating factions. Factions is definitely something that's really important to Dungeons and Dragons as a whole. And in my opinion, kind of the more factions you have, the better off you're going to be. And it's going to be based on the size of the scale of your world, obviously. I've actually been working over on my world and campaign setting for years now, well over a decade. Actually, probably looking closer to 2.5 decades at this point that I've been working on my campaign setting. So I have a lot of different factions, and usually they're cultural based and whatnot. And I kind of just want to cover creating different factions here. Now, you're going to have different types of factions, and this is going to cover everything from guilds to military factions, such as like the King's Guard, or, just a military power, or mercenary forces, as well as religious. And I've actually discussed in the past how important religion would be technically within the world of Dungeons and Dragons outside of clerics and paladins, just going off of history. Now, there's a couple things that factions are going to provide the players. They're going to provide benefits as well as being quest givers. There could also end up being enemies as well as part of quests. And also, they can work as hirelings in the case of mercenary factions. Now, there's a couple different things that you're going to outline besides the type. Another place I usually go with is the faction good, evil, or neutral, kind of down the middle somehow, or at least their intention anyway. Also, the faction's role itself. What is the faction's role? Is it to defend the king in the case of the King's Guard, or, maybe in the case of Robin Hood and his men, merry men, it would be, robbing the rich and giving to the poor, things of that nature. So, what is the primary role of your faction? With that being said, too, the role should be angled somewhere around the goals, as they're going to have, your factions are going to have short-term goals and they're going to have long-term goals. Their short-term goals might be, I don't know, rescuing all stray dogs, and sooner or later it might be, their long-term goal might be house all dogs. I don't know, something along those lines. Another example would be the Knights Templar. I would say their short term goal was to go on crusade and take Jerusalem. And then their long term goal would be obviously defeat the enemies of God and hold Jerusalem as long as they could. So there you go. Some examples of short term and long term goals. The next thing I would also usually cover is resources. What kind of resources are they going to have? Are they going to have horses? Are they going to have armor, weapons, shields, food, mills, blacksmiths, brewing locations in the case of like a brewer's guild, stuff of that nature? Are they going to have a wide variety of different types of thieves' tools and equipment in the case of the Thieves Guild? That's all going to be part of the resources. Basically, equipment and extra stuff on top of that. What is the size of the faction? An elite military force might be a smaller faction, although it would be quite large compared to, say, like a thieves guild. But compared to like a general military force, an elite force, smaller force would be, or an elite force would be a smaller force, where a mercenary force might only be a dozen men. And then obviously, you know, the church guard, the paladins, if you will, the paladin corps, I guess we'll call it for now. That might be even smaller still, where it might only total 50 men or 100 men, something along those lines. Where the thieves guild, your local thieves guild for your town or city might only have a dozen men at its disposal. So size is gonna matter. Also, with that in mind, the bigger the faction, the more resources they're going to need. And if you're looking at military structure wise, or some type of militaristic faction, the I would say the elite forces are going to have better resources than, say, general forces. Now, with that being said, you also got to include their base. Where is their base of operation located? What is their base of operation? What does it look like? And this could range anywhere from like a guild house to an underground sewer den, to a military encampment. It might be a small encampment in the case of like a mercenary force. They might just live essentially from encampment to encampment because of constantly going from different employers that hire them. Logo is another thing that you should have, some type of logo for them, so that way they can be identified, maybe by a sign. In the case of like many of your guilds, your craftsmen or tradesmen guilds, they're definitely going to have a sign that's advertised. Now, the Thieves Guild, not so much. Your military forces are going to have some kind of emblem as well, or logo, and that is so that they can be identified by both friendly and enemy forces. Also, one thing I think that should be included to help add some flavor is actually the flavor and theme of the group itself. What kind of garb do they wear? Do they have uniforms? Things of that nature. Who is their leader? And why is he their leader? And this kind of rolls into designing useful NPCs or creating useful NPCs. That's a video I actually did in the past, and I'll try to have a link in the video description so you can go check that out. But essentially, the leader should be some type of useful NPC with some type of simple character background and etc. And essentially, pretty much outline why he is the leader. What is his goals? His goals might actually be different than the guild's goals, which could cause some problems. That's something for you to figure out and maybe make some quest off of. Maybe you're setting up some quest where essentially the members of the guild doesn't actually agree with the leader's leadership and they want to overthrow him or make him look incompetent, whatever, essentially sabotage him. But they don't want their mark left behind on it, so they employ your players to do said task. That could be pretty interesting. And besides a structure, the next thing that you should have is some type of structure. What is the size? Essentially, this rolls also into the size of your force. What is the size of your structure? What is the ranks? How do you climb up the structure? Is it a knowledge-based thing? Is it a training-based thing? Is it a service-based thing? Whatever. Maybe it's points. Maybe the Thieves Guild has some kind of point system that they've come up with that it's like, oh, well, you stole this, it's this amount of points, or you did this, it's this amount of points. Okay, now you get a rank, you've proven yourself, now you get a promotion. And with that being said, also, when it comes to the structure, what kind of benefits being within the structure provides if they want to join, as well as what does it take to actually join said structure. Maybe for like an adventurers guild, it might be something along the lines of you got to do some kind of quest for them as like a trial quest, if you will, and they decide if they're going to accept you as a member or not. Another thing that you should cover also when creating your factions is the enemies and allies of said faction, especially other factions. Obviously, but I guess probably the best example is with Cain Leonidas and his Spartans. You have the Spartans, that's essentially the factions. We're using that as the example faction, and the allies would be, or any allies would be essentially any allies of Sparta, where any enemies would be any enemies of Sparta, such as Xerxes' army. So that's pretty much your enemies and allies. Your Thieves Guild, they may not really have any ally factions, but they will have enemy factions such as local law enforcement or any religious orders. Of course, they may not consider the religious order even as an enemy. So I would say when we are edging out your enemies and allies, edge out if it's an active enemy or a passive enemy. In the sense of an active enemy, this is they're gunning, aiming to kill each other. Uh, or if it's a passive where they're not, I don't know how to put it, like maybe something along the lines of you would, like the church, if they saw any thieving acts from the Thieves Guild, they would report it obviously to the local law enforcement. So the Thieves Guild sees the the local temple or religion, if you will, as an enemy because of that. And the final thing I usually edge out is the faction's history. And usually I keep it fairly short. It doesn't have to be extremely well detailed, although probably the more information you have, the better off it's going to be, the more fleshed out it'll be, especially for older factions. An ancient faction should actually have a fairly extensive history, where a newer, younger faction might not have much in the way of a history at all. Or in the case of like the Thieves Guild, there may not even be a written history to the faction. Uh, Something along those lines. Something to just kind of think about when designing your factions. But anyway, folks, I'm going to wrap up today's video at that. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourself a wonderful day.